in school days, at a meeting of the little circle that our good Tom Lawrence, Beverno, who was my spiritual father, one of the monks running our little parish or big parish in Cardiff, we had an encounter with a local group from another church, another chapel. It was the local Methodist group, and their young pastor came with them, and at one point Tom Lawrence, to get the ball rolling, asked a question to this good man, who was actually very well formed. He was a doctor in theology, very eloquent and a good man to listen to, and by the way, that is something that we need to be aware of when handling our separated brethren. For we have a situation sometimes where they are more qualified than we are professionally and theologically. I mean by the amount of study they've put into it. When it regards the teachers, we have a situation in Wales, for instance, where in an ecumenical meeting, sometimes the clergy of other groups have far more clout as regards their education than what we might summon up and muster, and that is not actually the best way forward with regard to the witness that we have to give. It also applies to the education that people have when it comes to their own culture. It is correct that the pastor be as professionally competent in his sphere as the people out there in the pew, because it is no use if he is handling people of a higher professional quality than he as regards their own expertise, and people will pick it up straight away. And it's one of the problems actually that can actually come when we have situations of people presuming to command respect and authority by only the fact that they are priests. It works up to a point, but if they cannot also on their human capacity command respect for what they are in their own person, able to stand up as it were in their humanity, it doesn't help. We have to be therefore able to command respect on every level if we want natural authority without aggressing people or talking down to them. But this is a little parenthesis, because the answer to a puzzling question that John Lawrence posed was this. It was at Antioch, as we have in today's reading, that the Christians first got that name. It was there that the disciples were first called Christians. Where do the Methodists come from? That is the name. And he gave a very balanced answer with historic reference to what happened in the 1700s and how initially within the Anglican Communion they were very methodological in their way of doing things. And when eventually they became known as a group, the label, which was initially a nickname, stuck and remained. And then when they came out of the Anglican Communion and became their own denomination, they of course were still to be known as Methodists. But we look, when we are asking where a group comes from, to the origin, and they would look to what happened with regard to the Wesleys and so on. Therefore they can usually find a name. It will happen also with regard to Lutherans. They will find a name. It will happen also with regard to Calvinists. They will find a name. And on it will go. With regard to the Apostolic Churches, they will look back to the apostle that founded them. We have the Christians of St. Thomas down in India. We have the various liturgical families, and we have the very large family of what came from the centre of the West, Rome. That extends to the Celtic liturgies and all that came essentially from that central point of diffusion of the gospel. Now Peter, of course, was initially bishop in this first, essentially Greek, and it mentions the word Greek coming in here rather than Hebrew, group outside Jerusalem. And the see of Antioch would have been initially that of Peter. And it's only in a second time that the gospel was able to permeate sufficiently Rome itself for him then to be its own bishop. But not for long, for he was martyred. But he is the rock on which the Church of Rome was to stand. And therefore, when there was a weakening of the West after the fall of Rome, there was an instinct to look towards New Rome, Constantinople, as the centre of solidity. And it could have gone that way, but the Holy Spirit prevented it from going that way against political pressure. And Rome was maintained, despite its political weakness, for a while, as essentially the rock, the centre. It had to be that way. And primus inter pares was the way in which he was to be looked upon, even by the Eastern patriarchs. Of course, we have what happened as time went on, that the East also, Constantinople, became very much weakened politically, and it was at that point that they looked again towards Rome, and that led to the Council of Florence, in which for a while the union was re-established, and the hope had been that that would also be a means of acquiring military support to save the crumbling Constantinople from falling to the Turkish and therefore Islamic bloc. Unfortunately, when the Eastern bishops got back, the people did not accept the union with Rome, and therefore it had little effect, and Constantinople fell. But Rome is still central, and the church cannot be the church without Peter. With regard to Christians looking back to their origin and who founded them, we have the fact here that they're first called Christians, and therefore the word Christos is there. Christ is our founder. And apostolic churches look back to the apostles precisely, those sent, as the word apostle implies, apostellin, by the Lord. Now this is kind of important, because if that is not there, then the succession is not there. And no matter what might happen with regard to the appearances of a succession, for instance in the Lutheran situation, or the Anglican one, where many of the trimmings are maintained, if the succession is not secure, then the priesthood is not there. It changes little. In fact, it changes nothing with regard to the real presence. If the celebrant in the non-Catholic sphere happens to be a high churchman, he may believe whatever he wants. It's an objective presence, and it's not there if the priesthood is not there. It's kind of important to bear that in mind. Now, with regard, therefore, to our faith, one looks also with great respect to those other apostolic churches which have lost full communion but have maintained their apostolic origin and succession. Why? Because the fact, strangely enough, that they have no means of having an ecumenical council as we do, and therefore of changing things hugely, is a blessing in disguise for them. For they therefore have the instinct of never tampering with what is greater than them, and they cannot in any way imagine fiddling around with something apostolic. So the origin of their practice is, by the very fact of its antiquity and continuity, a lesson and a witness unto us. If we want to see how things were done in the early centuries, one looks to the other apostolic churches, and one sees precisely things of an ancient origin. They're very ancient, some of these rites. And one sees also the way how the Spirit, according to the culture and temperament of each part of the world, worked and used and caused to grow and develop what was natural to them. It was also our own case in the West. And in a correct application of what was essentially a simplifying and a purifying of overgrown growth in the Second Vatican Council, normally that should have been the case also in the West and can still be in a good celebration. Unfortunately, what has happened is that it has been applied by people who haven't a historic awareness and are not often, it can be the case quite often in good monasteries that they are, but very often the actual safeguard of a profound contemplative awareness of the sacrality of what they're handling is having to yield to the immediacy of pleasing, apparently, the people who are there, and therefore having to behave in a very human way, in a way which is unthinkable in the East. And it's not healthy, because then we get into a new mode which is worse than Protestantism. Because in their own mode, good Protestants do create the atmosphere which is quite sacred, by diction, bearing and otherness in their own mode. We try to ape them and miss the point badly. They grow up with it. We have grown up with something other, which is quite self-sufficient and does not need improvement. So good application does not necessarily mean jettisoning. It means living intelligently what is received, and within the parameters of authorized renewal, applying in a way that is led by the Spirit and not by man. It can be done, and there are huge advantages in the present rite, because, for instance, it allows for pauses, and therefore, in a certain sense, interiority, because the priest and the people are able, if they listen and read carefully what they're invited to do, they're able to have a very contemplative celebration, because the priest can quietly pause and lead the people with him into that august silence, which often, alas, is the first thing to go in a wordy celebration. And talkative priests in the liturgy too will talk a lot and actually get hugely in the way of the Holy Spirit. It's not that difficult to celebrate in a contemplative mode the present rite, but it does presume maturity and deep interiority. When these are missing, things are bound to go wrong, and therefore if there's an illness, one doesn't just look at the symptoms, but one tries to get to the illness, and until that profound issue is handled, all the rest is bound to be just external bandaging and cosmetics.